Everyone knows Dexter Morgan as the serial killer who only kills other killers, but his full story is far stranger and darker than that simple description suggests. It spans 20 years, 4 series, and 2 finales that devastated audiences for completely different reasons. Each chapter changed Dexter in ways the previous one never could. In this video, we break down Dexter's entire story. Section 1. Born in Blood. Laura Moser had been working as an informant for Miami detective Harry Morgan, feeding him information about a drug operation run by a man named Hector Estrada. It was the kind of arrangement that worked until it stopped working. And when Estrada's people found out what Laura had been doing, they moved quickly and without mercy. They took her and her 2 young sons to a shipping yard. What happened inside the container was over fast. The boys stayed there for 2 days before anyone found them. Harry pulled the youngest one out, carried him home, and eventually adopted him. That child was Dexter Morgan. Dexter grew up in the Morgan household as a quiet, attentive child who was good at school and fond of his sister, and who had, by the time he was 10 or 11 years old, begun killing the neighborhood animals. Harry noticed. A detective who had spent years reading the behavior of people under pressure recognized what he was looking at in his adopted son, and the recognition forced a decision that Harry would spend the rest of his life uncertain about. He could treat it as a sickness to be addressed, to be medicated and therapized and suppressed. He did not believe suppression would work. He had looked at that child in the container and seen something that he did not think treatment could reach. So instead, he built a structure around it. The code was straightforward in its basic logic. Only kill people who have themselves killed others. Only kill those who have been clearly proven guilty of their crimes. Never leave evidence. Never draw attention. Do not kill innocent people under any circumstances. Harry spent years teaching Dexter how to satisfy what both of them came to call the dark passenger, the internal compulsion toward killing, without destroying their family, without ending up in prison, and without taking lives that did not deserve to be taken. Harry was a cop, and he understood evidence. He taught Dexter forensics from the ground up, brought him to crime scenes, explained blood behavior and trace evidence, and the specific things that investigators looked for. The education was practical. Harry was not interested in raising a philosopher. He was interested in keeping his son alive and free. Dexter went into forensic blood spatter analysis professionally, almost certainly because Harry had steered him there. The position gave him access to crime scenes, to active police investigations, to the information he needed to identify targets who had done what the code required. He joined Miami Metro Homicide as a civilian analyst and built a life that looked, from every visible angle, exactly like the life of an ordinary professional in his early 30s. A small apartment, a boat, a girlfriend named Rita Bennett, a quiet woman with 2 children from a previous marriage, to an abusive man whose own past had left her comfortable with the specific kind of emotional distance that Dexter could manage. He went to work. He attended crime scenes. He came home. At night, sometimes, he killed. The system he had for the kills was built on the same forensic knowledge Harry had given him. M99, a veterinary sedative, delivered by needle, taking a target down fast enough to prevent a struggle. Plastic sheeting across every surface of the room to prevent trace evidence. The kill table, the body restrained and wrapped. The blood slide, a single drop taken from a cut on the cheek before death, collected in a glass microscope slide and stored in a box with all the others. The slides were the only trophy he kept. Everything else was disposed of in the ocean, wrapped in biodegradable bags, dropped from his boat miles offshore. The system was meticulous, in the way that only someone who had been taught to think about evidence from childhood could make it. The first kill shown to the audience was Mike Donovan in the opening minutes of the pilot episode that aired on October 1st, 2006. Donovan was a boys' choir director, a man with a wife and children and a respected position in his community, who had raped and murdered at least 3 young boys. Dexter had found the bodies, had dug them up, and had then waited in the back seat of Donovan's car after a choir performance. He strangled Donovan with a garrote wire, forced him to drive to the location where the boys were buried, dragged him inside, and made him look at what he had done. Donovan cried. He said he could not help himself. Dexter told him he understood that feeling completely, and that he had standards the man had never had, and then sedated him and brought the night's work to its conclusion. This was how the show established the terms of its moral agreement with the audience in the space of about 8 minutes. The first person Dexter killed on screen was a child murderer. The identification of the target, the proof of guilt, and the visible evidence of his crimes were all presented before the kill happened. The code was demonstrated rather than explained. The viewer was given everything needed to decide whether they were willing to stay on board, and enough of them were that the premiere drew over 1 million viewers and became the highest-rated original series premiere in Showtime's history to that point. The Miami Metro case that ran through Season 1 arrived almost immediately. A killer was leaving bodies around the city in a manner unlike anything the department had seen, completely drained of blood, cut into precise pieces, and displayed. The work was technical and careful, the signature of someone who understood bodies and fluids and the specific physics of what he was doing. The first victim appeared to have been worked on hurriedly, as if the killer had been interrupted before finishing. Later victims were more complete, more elaborate, the signature more fully expressed. The press named the killer the ice truck killer because of the specific condition of some of the remains. Miami Metro assigned the case to the homicide division where Dexter worked, which meant he was analyzing the crime scenes of a killer whose work he found himself admiring in ways he could not quite explain. The first contact between Dexter and the ice truck killer happened on a street in Miami. Dexter had followed a refrigerated truck through the city, curiosity pulling him toward it, and the driver had become aware of being followed. The truck stopped. A severed head came through Dexter's windshield, thrown from the other vehicle, and then the truck was gone. The gesture was not threat, it was introduction. The ice truck killer had been watching Dexter, knew enough about him to reach out through the language of what they both were, and was communicating. Later, a doll's head appeared in Dexter's apartment refrigerator, the rest of the doll's body arranged inside. The staging was personal, aimed at Dexter specifically, a private message from someone who understood him. The ice truck killer worked his way into Dexter's life through a second angle simultaneously. A man named Rudy Cooper appeared in Deborah Morgan's life and began dating her. Rudy was handsome and attentive, and made Deborah happy in ways that she had not been for a long time, and Dexter watched the relationship develop while also pursuing the investigation. Deborah, who worked in the Vice Squad and was pushing to be transferred to homicide, had no idea the man she was falling for was the same person leaving bloodless body parts around Miami. Rudy was careful. He had the same precision as the scenes he left behind. A young man named Tony Tucci was abducted during the season and slowly dismembered while alive, his body parts placed at public locations across the city at 7 in the morning every day. The specific locations were places where Harry Morgan had taken young Dexter to teach him lessons about the code. The ice truck killer knew Harry's history with Dexter. The killer was not just communicating with Dexter generally. He was communicating with a knowledge of Dexter's most private past that only someone with direct access to that past could have possessed. The answer arrived in the final episodes of the season. The ice truck killer was Brian Moser, Dexter's biological brother. The boy Harry had left behind in the psychiatric facility had spent his entire life working backward toward the moment they were separated. Brian had been released from the institution at 21 and had spent the years since building toward this reunion, constructing an alias as Rudy Cooper, insinuating himself into Dexter's orbit, killing in a way that expressed what they both shared and that he was certain only Dexter could read correctly. The bodies drained of blood were a reference to the shipping container, to the 2 small boys surrounded by their mother's blood. Brian was recreating their origin. He was showing Dexter that he remembered and that he had never stopped being what the container had made him. The confrontation between the brothers unfolded at the shipping yard, at the container where their mother had died. Brian took Dexter there and told him everything, and what he wanted was not revenge and not recognition, but something closer to family. He wanted Dexter to choose him over the life Harry had built. He had arranged Deborah in a kill room, staged as a victim, and was offering Dexter the choice of whether to save her or join his brother in a life without the code's constraints. He framed it as liberation. He framed Harry's code as a prison that Dexter could now walk out of. Dexter could not do it. Not because the code compelled him in some mechanical way, but because Deborah was the one person whose loss Dexter knew he could not manage. Whatever he did or did not feel by the standard of ordinary human emotion, the absence of Deborah was something he recognized as a damage he was not willing to sustain. He freed her, and then, because Brian had killed a nurse who had discovered his activities, because Brian had taken an innocent life, the code said what it always said. Dexter went back. He found his brother in a hotel room. Brian seemed almost pleased, or at least not surprised. Dexter killed him the same way he killed anyone else, and then sat in the room for a while afterward, in the particular silence that follows the only thing he could not explain. Harry Morgan was already dead by the time all of this happened. He had died years earlier in a hospital, his heart failing after a long illness. In flashbacks during the first season, the specific nature of Harry's final days was clarified in a way that had not been in the earlier episodes. Harry had seen what his teaching had produced. He had come to Dexter's kill room as a young man and watched his adopted son at work, and what he saw had done something to him that medicine could not address. He had built the code as a way to control and direct an impulse he believed he could not stop. When he saw the impulse expressed in full, the intellectual construct met the physical reality, and Harry could not reconcile them. He died in his hospital bed. In a flashback shown late in the first season, Dexter was present at the end and made the decision that ended Harry's suffering. The man who had created Dexter's framework died by the logic of the framework he had created. Dexter decided, and then he acted. The first season ended with a body in a hotel room and a blood slide added to the collection box. Miami Metro had its ice truck killer, though they did not fully understand the case they thought they had closed. Deborah was shaken and recovering. Dokes, the homicide sergeant who had been watching Dexter with open suspicion since the first episode, had not found what he was looking for yet, but had not stopped looking. Rita was unaware of most of what had happened, and Dexter Morgan was back in his apartment, back on his boat, back at his desk in the forensics lab, looking like exactly what he appeared to be, an ordinary person with a job and a routine and a life that required nothing extraordinary of anyone around him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Season 1 established everything the show would spend years building on: the code, the blood slides, the double life, and the one relationship Dexter could not bring himself to sacrifice. Season 2 arrived with a question the code had no clean answer for. What happens when the bodies come back up? Section 2. Bodies in the Bay. Scuba divers found them 65 feet down off the coast of Miami. 18 dismembered bodies packed into biodegradable bags, weighted with rocks, sitting on the ocean floor for years. Every victim inside was a murderer who had avoided conviction. The analyst assigned to help examine them in the field morgue was the man who had put them there. 38 days had passed since Dexter killed Brian Moser. In that time, something had shifted. The dark passenger had gone quiet in a way Dexter could not explain and could not fix. He was going weeks without killing, not because he was choosing to stop, but because the specific focus and calm required to execute a kill, the way the code demanded, were not coming. He attempted a kill and abandoned it, which had never happened before. He tried again and found the same problem. Whatever internal mechanism had always activated when the time came was stuttering, and without the release it provided, he was unraveling in small daily ways that he could feel but not articulate. The confrontation with Brian, the recognition of what he had been built from and what he had chosen to remain, had done something to the machinery. Rita, watching him without understanding what she was watching, decided the problem was addiction. She had been told almost nothing about Dexter's real history, but she could see a man struggling with something he was hiding, and addiction was a framework she understood from her previous marriage. She asked him to get help. He agreed, because refusing would have required an explanation he did not have, and because the structure of a program might provide its own kind of order while the internal order recovered. He began attending Narcotics Anonymous meetings and standing up in rooms full of strangers to describe, in the precise language of the program, an addiction that was not to any substance. He described the need taking over. He described the relief that came with giving in. He described the specific pleasure of the kill in terms that fit the NA framework perfectly, and that no one in those rooms recognized for what they actually were. Every honest thing he said about himself was heard as metaphor by the people around him. At one of those meetings, he met Lila Tournay. She was British, an artist, apparently in recovery herself, and she had a particular quality of attention that most people do not carry into ordinary social situations. She became his sponsor, and then something more complicated. She was drawn to the darkness in Dexter in a way that went beyond curiosity, and Dexter found her useful in the specific sense that she asked questions about his inner life that pushed him toward clarity rather than away from it. The relationship with Rita, which was warm and domestic and required Dexter to perform a kind of normalcy that had never fully fit, gave way for a period to something more honest and considerably more dangerous. He brought Lila to the field morgue and showed her the Bay Harbor butcher victims. Her response was not horror. She stood among the evidence of 18 murders and expressed something closer to admiration. Dexter was disturbed by this and could not stop thinking about it. Frank Lundy arrived from the FBI as the body count in the field morgue kept growing. He was a veteran investigator, methodical and patient, the kind of agent who had been doing this long enough to understand that the most important work happened slowly. He built a behavioral profile of the Bay Harbor butcher from the physical evidence, and the profile was accurate in every significant detail. Someone with forensic training, someone who understood police investigative procedure, someone almost certainly connected to law enforcement. He knew all of this. He was in the same building as Dexter every day. He never arrived at the correct conclusion, because the correct conclusion was too close, too implausible, too embedded in the familiar. Deborah, assigned to the Butcher Task Force, began a relationship with Lundy during the investigation. He was significantly older, and she did not particularly care. He was serious and principled, and treated her as a capable investigator, rather than as a junior officer to be managed, and she responded to that treatment. The relationship was real on both sides, and its eventual end, when Lundy's assignment concluded, was the kind of loss that left Deborah with a specific kind of emptiness she did not know how to address. Miami Metro had a suspect, and the suspect was Dokes. His open surveillance of Dexter, the fact that he had been following Dexter in ways that were documented and flagged by supervisors, placed him in proximity to crime scenes and in behavioral patterns that matched the profile Lundy was building. Dokes being suspected was not an accident of circumstance. Dexter understood what the investigation was constructing and worked carefully to help it build in Dokes' direction. Evidence that could have complicated the Dokes narrative was managed. Details that pointed elsewhere were neutralized. Dexter broke into the field morgue at night and sabotaged the coolant system, destroying the bodies with mold and heat, eliminating a forensic lead that Masuka had identified around algae on the rocks used to weight the bags. He appeared at his desk the following morning and analyzed the damage alongside his colleagues. The public, following the investigation through the media, was not uniformly convinced that the Bay Harbor butcher needed to be stopped. Every victim identified by DNA analysis was a murderer who had avoided justice. The argument that ran through neighborhoods and talk radio and comment sections was straightforward. The system had failed on every one of those 18 cases, and someone had corrected the failure. A comic book concept called the Dark Defender appeared, turning the Bay Harbor butcher into a masked vigilante hero. Rita's own mother told Dexter, sitting in his living room, that the butcher should be left alone. Dexter sat with that and did not move. Dokes tracked Dexter to the Everglades. The confrontation was physical, and the outcome was not what Dokes had been planning for. Dexter got control of the situation and locked Dokes in a cage at a remote cabin deep in the swamp, far enough from any road or settlement that the odds of anyone coming across it accidentally were close to nothing. He left Dokes there and returned to Miami to continue his double life. Over the days that followed, Dexter visited the cabin repeatedly. The conversations that happened through the cage bars were the most honest exchanges Dexter had with any person in the show's first 2 seasons. Dokes did not try to manipulate or deceive. He pushed directly, turn yourself in, Take responsibility. Stop letting innocent people carry what belongs to you. Dexter listened without dismissing him. He did not agree, but he heard the argument, and he could not fully counter it. He simply had the key, and Dokes did not, and that imbalance made the conversation what it was. Dokes had found the bloodslide collection box before the Everglades confrontation. He had the physical evidence, the only trophy Dexter kept, the one thing that proved beyond behavioral analysis that the Bay Harbor Butcher was not James Dokes. The slides were in the cage with him. Lila found the cabin. The specific chain of events that led her there ran through her relationship with Dexter and her particular quality of attentiveness, the same quality that had made her feel like a genuine connection in those NA meetings. She had been paying closer attention to Dexter than he had appreciated, and she followed the details she had gathered to the Everglades. When she arrived and opened the cabin door and found Dokes in the cage, she understood immediately what she was looking at and what it meant. She found the propane line connected to the structure. She opened the valve, walked away, and waited. The explosion destroyed the cabin and James Dokes and the bloodslide box. The Bay Harbor Butcher case closed within days. The evidence pointed at the man who had died in the fire, and the investigation accepted what the evidence said. Lundy filed his findings. Miami Metro held a press conference. Dokes was named the Bay Harbor Butcher. His years of service as a decorated officer erased in a single announcement. His reputation destroyed by the crimes of the man he had spent 2 seasons trying to catch. Lundy told Deborah privately that he had doubts. The physical evidence at the cabin was consistent with the conclusion, but the behavioral profile he had built did not fully fit Dokes the way it should have. He sat with those doubts without acting on them, and eventually his assignment ended and he returned to Washington, and the doubts went with him, documented in his notes and not in any active file. Deborah knew the doubts existed. She carried them without knowing what to do with them, and they would surface again years later in a different context. Dexter ended his relationship with Lila. Whatever she had given him during the season, the particular permission to speak honestly about his interior life without a full translation into safer language, was outweighed by what she had done and what she now knew. She had killed a man without hesitation or guilt. She had done it to protect Dexter, which meant she understood him in a way that made her the most dangerous person in his life. He told her it was over and watched her receive the information. Her response unfolded over the following weeks. Lila did not accept endings in the way that most people accept them. She sent messages. She appeared in places she should not have been. She dug into the details of Dexter's life with Rita and the children in a way that was not grief or longing, but something colder. When she discovered the specific evidence of what Dexter and Rita were to each other, she made a decision and acted on it. She found the hotel where Rita and her children Astor and Cody were staying with Dexter and set fire to the room they were sleeping in. The fire spread fast. They escaped. Rita and the children were not injured, but the gap between what happened and what could have happened was narrow enough that Dexter understood exactly what Lila was capable of and what it now required of him. He tracked her to Paris. She had left Miami and fled to France, apparently believing that distance and a different country would provide the same protection that distance from Dokes had not. Dexter followed the information available to him, found her apartment, and killed her there. The kill was without ceremony. She was not wrapped in plastic, and she was not given a blood slide. She was simply someone who had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and he addressed the problem the only way he had ever addressed that category of problem. He returned to Miami and to Rita. The season ended with that return, with the specific domestic warmth of a man coming back to a life that was genuinely his, even if the people in it did not know him fully. The Dark Passenger had recovered its voice during the season's progression. The kills had come back. The system was working again, changed slightly by everything that had happened, recalibrated. The underwater graveyard was gone, the bodies dispersed beyond recovery. The Bay Harbor Butcher was officially dead, and Dexter Morgan was back at his desk in Miami Metro, looking at blood, going to work. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Bay Harbor Butcher case closed with the wrong man taking the blame, and the show moved into its third season, with Dexter's secret intact and his life with Rita growing towards something he had not planned for. What arrived next was a friendship that would force the code to answer a question Harry had never addressed. Section 3. The First Friend. Oscar Prado's last words were a question. He was bleeding on the floor of Freebo's house, looking up at the man who had stabbed him, and asked, "Who are you?" Dexter had no answer. He asked the same thing back. Then Oscar was dead, Freebo had escaped out the back, and Dexter was standing alone in a room where everything had gone wrong. Oscar was not on any list. He had 3 traffic violations and a drug habit and a debt to Freebo, the dealer Dexter had tracked to that address. He had been attacking Freebo with a knife when Dexter arrived, and in the struggle that followed, Oscar had knocked a dental crown loose from Dexter's tooth before Dexter turned Oscar's own knife around and drove it in. The code did not cover this. Harry had built rules for the specific category of person Dexter was meant to kill, and Oscar Prado did not belong to that category. He was not a murderer. He was a man in a bad situation who had walked into the same room as Dexter Morgan on the wrong night, and now he was dead on the floor of a drug dealer's house. Dexter attended Oscar's wake. He went because Miguel Prado, Oscar's older brother and one of Miami's most visible assistant district attorneys, had invited him at the crime scene the following day. Miguel had met Dexter over Oscar's body, had noticed the particular quality of Dexter's attention at the scene, and had taken something in Dexter's manner as the response of a man who understood loss in a specific way. Dexter went to the wake, partly to manage the situation, and partly because he needed to understand who Oscar actually was. He researched the dead man the same way he researched targets, looking for something that would ease the weight of having broken Harry's rules. What he found was not a killer. It was a young man with a complicated life and a family who loved him, and the weight did not ease. Deborah eventually found what Dexter had been looking for. Working the Freebo case from the investigative side, she learned from an informant that Oscar had been a drug user himself, in debt to Freebo, and had gone to that house on his own terms for his own reasons. He had also been in the process of attacking 2 people with a knife when Dexter intervened. The information did not retroactively justify the kill under the code's strict terms, but it softened the edges of the problem enough for Dexter to move forward. Oscar had not been what Dexter's internal calculus required, but he had not been entirely what the wake suggested either. The friendship with Miguel grew from an unlikely starting point. Miguel was powerful, connected, and emotionally raw after Oscar's death, and he channeled that rawness into a pursuit of Freebo that brought him repeatedly into Dexter's orbit. They began spending time together in the way that grown men rarely do, unless something unusual has bonded them. Golf, lunch, dinner with their partners, the particular social architecture of a friendship that appeared normal from the outside. For Dexter, who had spent his entire adult life performing every relationship he had, this was new territory. Miguel asked him questions that most people did not ask. Miguel paid the kind of attention to Dexter that only people genuinely interested in someone pay. It was the first time in his life that Dexter had someone to spend time with who he did not feel required to deceive at every level. When Dexter finally tracked Freebo down and killed him, Miguel witnessed the aftermath. He arrived at the location shortly after the kill, found Dexter leaving with a weapon, and received an explanation that he chose to believe. Freebo had come at him. Dexter had defended himself. Miguel did not need to investigate that account. His brother's killer was dead, and Dexter had provided that outcome. He gave Dexter a shirt stained with what he said was Freebo's blood, telling Dexter he trusted him and that the shirt could serve as evidence if Dexter ever needed protection from legal questions about Freebo's death. Dexter had the shirt tested. The blood was bovine, from a cow. Miguel had given him a fabricated token of trust, built from false materials, and Dexter cataloged this fact and kept it. The friendship continued anyway. Miguel pushed it towards something more specific. He had watched Dexter enough to understand, without being told directly, that what happened at Freebo's location was not an isolated incident, that Dexter's relationship with death was more structured and more deliberate than a single act of self-defense could account for. He began asking questions that moved in that direction. And Dexter, for reasons that mixed genuine longing for connection with a failure of the caution Harry had always preached, started answering them. He told Miguel about the code. He explained what it required, and what it ruled out, and why Harry had built it. Miguel listened with the expression of a man receiving confirmation of something he had already suspected. He wanted to participate. The specific language he used was about justice, about the gap between what the law could accomplish and what certain people deserved. Miguel worked inside the legal system every day and knew its limits better than most. He had seen killers walk free on procedural grounds and watched victims' families absorb outcomes that the system offered no language to adequately address. The code, as Dexter explained it, was the answer to exactly that gap. Miguel wanted to be part of it. Dexter agreed to what felt like a controlled arrangement, a test essentially. A target who met the code's requirements, walked through together, with Dexter in control of every step. The target was Clemson Galt, the leader of a neo-Nazi group, with confirmed kills attached to his name. Miguel went through the process, participated in the kill, and did not break. Dexter assessed the outcome and found it acceptable. He began working with Miguel more deliberately, bringing him along on another kill, teaching him what Harry had taught him. Miguel killed a debt enforcer named Billy Fleeter and handled it without visible distress. What came next revealed the problem that the friendship had been concealing all along. Miguel killed Ellen Wolfe without Dexter's knowledge. Wolfe was a defense attorney who had spent years getting guilty clients acquitted on technical grounds, and Miguel had a personal history of professional frustration with her work. She was not a murderer. She had never killed anyone. She was someone Miguel disliked, and whose work Miguel believed caused harm. But the code's threshold for a target was not dislike, and it was not professional frustration. Miguel had taken what Dexter had taught him and applied it to a situation where it did not fit, substituting his own judgment for a standard that had been designed to remove personal judgment from the process. When Dexter pieced together what had happened, the friendship recalibrated instantly and permanently. Miguel had not simply misunderstood the code. He had understood it well enough to replicate its mechanics, and had then used those mechanics for a purpose the code explicitly excluded. He had been studying the method without ever genuinely accepting the principle. Dexter confronted him. Miguel was not remorseful. He argued that his version of justice was as legitimate as Dexter's version, that the distinction between a murderer and a defense attorney who helped murderers go free was a matter of how broadly the category was drawn. Dexter did not accept that argument, but more immediately, Miguel had now become something that required a practical response. LaGuerta had opened an investigation into Ellen Wolfe's death and was following threads that led toward Miguel. Miguel's solution to that problem was to kill LaGuerta before she could arrive at the conclusion. He told Dexter his plan directly, partly as a statement of intent and partly as a demonstration that he was operating outside Dexter's control now and understood it. He also made clear that if Dexter interfered, he would use every resource available to him as an assistant district attorney to expose Dexter and to create legal problems for Deborah. He had prepared leverage. The friendship had never been without calculation. Dexter lured Miguel to LaGuerta's house and killed him with a wire before he could reach her. The staging was deliberate. Miguel's death was arranged to look like the work of the Skinner, the season's secondary threat who had been operating throughout Miami looking for Freebo, and who killed by skinning his victims alive. George King, the man behind the Skinner killings, was a Nicaraguan barbed wire manufacturer who had been owed money by Freebo and had been working through anyone connected to that debt in the most extreme possible way. Framing Miguel's death as the Skinner's work solved two problems simultaneously. It closed the question of what had happened to Miguel, and it pointed the investigation toward a perpetrator who was real and who would eventually answer for his own crimes regardless. The Skinner found Dexter before Dexter found the Skinner. In the season's final stretch, King abducted Dexter and began the process that was his signature, using the threat of what he was about to do to extract information about Freebo's whereabouts. Dexter worked through the situation with the specific quality of focus that the code had always given him in high-pressure circumstances. He got free. He killed George King, breaking his neck, and the Skinner case closed, with the perpetrator dead and the Miami Metro investigation satisfied with the outcome. Rita's pregnancy had changed the shape of everything else the season contained. She had told Dexter early in the season that she was going to have the baby, whether he was part of it or not, and the clarity of that position required him to make a decision rather than manage the situation at a comfortable distance. He proposed. Rita said yes, and the domestic life that Harry had perhaps never imagined for what he had built began to assemble itself around Dexter, a woman who loved him, her children from a previous marriage, whom he had grown genuinely fond of, and now a child of his own on the way. Deborah made detective during the season, achieving a goal she had been working toward since the pilot. Her new partner was Joey Quinn, who arrived as an antagonistic presence in her professional life, and who would remain a complicated figure in the show for several seasons. Their dynamic, combative from the start, contained within it something that would eventually become something else, though that progression moved slowly. The season ended with a wedding. Dexter and Rita were married in the finale, in a ceremony that had the texture of something real rather than performed. Dexter stood in a room full of people who were there because they cared about the people getting married. And for once, the social architecture around him was not a cover story. He was marrying someone who made him something closer to happy than he had a theoretical framework for, in front of people who were genuinely glad about it. The show allowed the moment to be what it was without immediately undercutting it. The code had been tested by the friendship with Miguel and had held, and the season closed on a version of Dexter's life that looked, from the outside, like a life that was working. What was already in motion by the time the wedding ended would make season 4 the most devastating stretch of the show's run. But in that room, for that evening, the man who had been found sitting in his mother's blood in a shipping container was getting married, and the moment was allowed to be simple. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The wedding that closed season 3 marked the highest point of stability in Dexter's constructed life. Season 4 arrived with a new case, a new villain, and the systematic destruction of everything the previous 3 years had built. Section 4. The Family Man. Harrison Morgan arrived home at the end of season 3, and by season 4's opening, he had made Dexter's entire daily structure unworkable. The infant did not sleep on any schedule. The specific internal quiet Dexter depended on was gone, replaced by the noise of a household with 5 people and no pause button. The opening credits changed to show it. The mosquito was missed, the shirt got stained, the shoelace snapped. Frank Lundy came back to Miami. He had never fully accepted the closure of the Trinity killer case, and new evidence had brought him south again, certain that the killer he had been tracking for decades was active in the area. He and Deborah reconnected with the particular ease of 2 people who had left something unresolved and found it still there when they returned to each other. Lundy was older and calm in the way of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time, and Deborah responded to him the same way she had during the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation, as someone who treated her intelligence seriously and did not manage her the way her superiors at Miami Metro habitually did. Lundy had identified the kill pattern that gave the case its name. 3 murders, each in a different city, always between school breaks. A young woman found in her bathtub with her femoral artery cut, a mother of 2 killed by a fall from height, and a father of 2 beaten to death. The 3 kills repeated, year after year, decade after decade, with different victims and different locations, but the same structure each time. Lundy had connected them across 30 years of cold cases and built a profile of a killer who had been operating longer than most careers. He called the case Trinity because the pattern had 3 parts. He did not yet know there was a 4th. Lundy was shot in a parking lot. Deborah was with him and was shot as well. Lundy died from his wound. Deborah survived and spent the weeks that followed investigating who had done it, working the case with the specific drive that personal loss generates in people who deal with violence professionally. The shooter turned out to be Christine Hill, a Miami journalist who had been covering the Trinity killer investigation while also feeding information about it to Trinity himself. She was Trinity's daughter, from a relationship before his marriage, the illegitimate child he visited once a year in secret, the one person outside his family who knew what he was. She had shot Lundy to protect her father and had shot Deborah because Deborah was there. When Christine was brought in and confronted with the evidence, and when it became clear that her father was not going to acknowledge her, not going to protect her in return for what she had done, she took her own life in the holding cell. Arthur Mitchell did not appear to register his daughter's death as a significant event. Dexter had been tracking Trinity separately from the official investigation. He had the same forensic access as Lundy and the same analytical skills, and he arrived at the same conclusions through a parallel process the department did not know was happening. When he identified Arthur Mitchell as the Trinity killer, the discovery stopped him in a way that identifications usually did not. Arthur Mitchell was a high school teacher and a church deacon and the founder of a charitable organization called Four Walls that built homes for underprivileged families across the country. He had a wife, Sally, a son named Jonah, a daughter named Rebecca. He had been a respected member of his community for decades, coaching youth programs and running fundraisers and attending church services. He had killed 69 times across 30 years, and not one person in his daily life had suspected him. The fascination that took hold of Dexter in that moment was not simply professional. He was looking at a man who had maintained everything he himself was trying to build: a domestic life, a family, a public identity as someone normal and good, all running alongside a compulsion toward murder that had never stopped. Arthur had been doing it for longer than Dexter had been alive. Dexter had been worried, since Harrison's birth, that his dark passenger and domestic life were fundamentally incompatible, that one would eventually destroy the other. Arthur Mitchell appeared to be evidence that the incompatibility could be managed. He wanted to understand how, before he killed him. He approached Arthur under the name Kyle Butler. The first contact was deliberate and careful, positioned to seem accidental, and Arthur received it with the particular attentiveness of someone who was also always watching. Their dynamic from the first encounter had a quality of mutual recognition without explicit acknowledgement. Each man understood something about the other that he could not have articulated without revealing himself. Arthur accepted Kyle Butler as a volunteer for the Four Walls organization, and the two of them spent time together building houses and driving to sites and attending church events. A serial killer and the man who intended to kill him going through the motions of a charitable friendship. The truth of Arthur's family life emerged gradually and was the opposite of what the public face suggested. Sally Mitchell was not a content spouse. She was a woman living in controlled terror, moving through her days in a household where any deviation from Arthur's expectations could produce violence. Jonah and Rebecca had grown up under the same conditions, learning from early childhood what happened when their father's rules were broken or his moods misread. The warmth Arthur displayed in public, the deacon's smile, and the youth volunteer's easy authority vanished entirely behind closed doors. His family had not found a way to live alongside his compulsion. They had been shaped by it into people who could not leave and could not speak. The Four Walls charity connected to the fourth stage of the kill cycle in a way that Dexter worked out over the course of the season. Trinity buried a 10-year-old boy alive in wet concrete at construction sites, always before the three-stage cycle everyone else had identified. The buried boy represented Arthur himself, at the age his innocence had ended, the child who had watched his sister bleed to death in a bathtub because he had startled her in the shower. Every year, Arthur buried that child again in someone else's body, at the construction sites his own charity maintained. He had been killing his own past at his charity's building projects for 30 years, in a stage of the cycle that Lundy had never identified. Dexter rented a small apartment during this period. The domestic life with Rita and the children had become something he could not breathe inside without a room that belonged entirely to himself, a space where no one made demands and no one needed anything. He told Rita he had rented the apartment to have a place closer to work. She found out the truth and interpreted it the way anyone might interpret a secret apartment their partner was keeping, as evidence of an affair. The crisis in their marriage that followed required Dexter to tell enough of the truth to make the lie stop working. He told her he felt like he was disappearing inside the domestic life they had built together, that he needed space in a way he had always needed it, that there was no other person. They reconciled at a weekend in the Keys that Rita arranged, a deliberate effort to find each other in the relationship rather than only in the household. Dexter drove home from that weekend with something close to peace. Arthur had been searching. He had seen Kyle Butler at a distance at an event where Dexter had attended as himself, not as his alias, and the two faces had not aligned cleanly. Arthur researched the name and the face, and the discrepancy led him to Dexter Morgan's real identity, to the address where Dexter lived, with his wife and stepchildren and infant son. He went there. Dexter was not home. He found Rita. What Arthur did in that bathroom was not a planned kill within his cycle. The stage he was in did not call for a bathtub victim. Rita did not fit the pattern of the young women whose femoral arteries he had been cutting for 30 years. He killed her anyway, out of sequence, as a message and as an act of damage delivered to the specific person who had been running alongside him, pretending to be something else. Rita Morgan was killed in her own bathtub, femoral artery cut in the same manner as Vera Mitchell's had been cut, while Harrison sat on the bathroom floor. Dexter caught Arthur after several more moves and counter-moves across the final episodes of the season. He took him to a kill room built inside a shipping container, a location whose significance to Dexter's own origin was not lost on him. Arthur died there, and the kill had the quality of an ending that should have been an ending. Dexter drove home afterward in a mood that the narration described with the specific lightness of a man who had done something conclusive. He had met the most dangerous opponent his career had produced, and he had closed it the way he closed every case. He heard Harrison crying when he came through the front door. He followed the sound. The bathroom door was open. What he found there closed the season, the same way his own life had begun 3 decades earlier, with a child sitting in a pool of blood that belonged to his mother, looking at nothing in particular, in a silence that had no name for what it was. The image held. The season ended on Harrison's face, and on the question of what that image meant for the child it was happening to, and on the understanding that the damage Dexter Morgan's existence caused had now found its way into the next generation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Season 4 ended with Dexter getting exactly what he deserved, and having it be the worst thing that had ever happened to him. Season 5 picked up in the immediate aftermath, with a man who had just lost his wife and found his son in her blood trying to work out what came next. Section 5, the weight of what he made. Dexter was standing in the front yard holding Harrison when the police arrived. He had carried the baby out of the bathroom and was not moving, not making calls, not doing any of the things a person in that situation was expected to do. When Deborah reached him and asked what happened, he said, "Rita's inside. It was me." He meant his existence had caused this. The police heard a confession. The first episode of Season 5 covered the hours immediately after the discovery. Dexter moved through them in a mode that looked, to every person watching him, like shock manifesting as coldness. He did not cry when told about Rita. He made a technically precise 911 call, describing what he had found in the bathroom with the same language he used in forensic reports. He told Astor and Cody that their mother was dead while wearing a Mickey Mouse hat, still on from a trip to the theme park earlier that day, and he delivered the information in the particular flat cadence of someone reciting facts rather than carrying them. Astor looked at him and said exactly what she saw. She told him she could tell just by looking at him that he did not even care. Then she got into her grandparents' car. Julie Benz came back for the premiere to film the crime scene and the funeral. She lay in the bathtub again, the blood recreated around her, while the investigation played out. She lay in a coffin during the funeral sequences. Hall later described his experience in those scenes as strange, in the specific way that performing grief over a performer you have worked with for 4 years is strange, a mixture of craft and something that could not be entirely separated from the real working relationship ending. Dexter gave a eulogy at the funeral that functioned as one of the show's most honest pieces of writing. A man who did not know how to express loss, speaking about a woman he had not known how to love, in a room full of people who were feeling things he could only observe. Before the funeral, he ran. He took his boat and went out onto the water and kept going until he ran out of gas. He pulled into a refueling station and found it mostly abandoned. A loud, unpleasant man named Rankin was there, the kind of person whose presence in any situation makes it worse, and Rankin directed his unpleasantness at Dexter. The dark passenger responded before any calculation could override it. Dexter followed Rankin into the bathroom and killed him there, not from the code, not from evidence of prior crimes, but from pure rage, the first unmediated emotional response the show had ever let him have. Harry appeared afterward and said something he had never said, that what Dexter had just done was the most human thing he had ever seen him do. Dexter dropped to the bathroom floor and screamed in a way that had no technique in it. The grief came out in the only form available to him, through violence, but it came out. He went back to Miami and gave the eulogy and buried Rita and returned to the life that remained. Deborah moved into the house to help with Harrison. Astor and Cody went to live with their maternal grandparents in Orlando, removed from the violence that had restructured their lives for the second time. The separation from the older children carried its own weight. Dexter had not expected to become attached to them and had discovered too late that he had. Harrison stayed. A nanny named Sonia was hired. The household reassembled itself around a smaller core, Dexter and his infant son and his sister, and the season moved into its actual story. The case that pulled Dexter's attention away from his grief was built around a series of bodies found preserved in barrels of liquid, women who had been held captive, abused, and killed by a group of men who had been doing it long enough to have developed a system. The investigation at Miami Metro treated it as a standard, if particularly horrific, homicide case. Dexter's entry point into the case was different. He had identified one member of the group, a roadkill collector named Boyd Fowler, whose work collecting and disposing of dead animals had provided cover for what he was doing with human victims. Dexter went to Boyd's property to kill him and found a woman alive. Lumen Pierce was the only surviving victim. Boyd had kept her longer than the others for reasons the season did not make entirely clear, and when Dexter arrived, she was still breathing. She had been through enough by that point that the sight of a man in her captor's house, in the middle of the night, was not something she could process with anything resembling calm. She fought. She ran when she could run. She attempted to flag down a passing car and was only prevented from doing so by the specific circumstances of the situation. Dexter managed the problem of her knowledge about him, the way he had always managed problems, by controlling the available information until the situation could be assessed. Her terror of him lasted through several episodes and was entirely reasonable. A woman who had just been released from captivity by one man who wanted to hurt her had no framework for understanding why a different man in the same house was treating her differently. Dexter told her enough truth to stabilize the situation, that Boyd was dead, that she was safe from Boyd specifically, and that there were other men involved in what had been done to her, and that he intended to find them. She asked why. He told her, with the particular economy of language that the code had always required, that he was someone who killed people who deserved it. She heard this and processed it, and did not run again. What developed between them was unlike any of Dexter's previous relationships because it was honest at its foundation rather than performed on top of a concealed reality. Lumen knew what he was. She had no illusions about the man helping her, and the absence of illusion meant that what grew between them was based on something real on both sides. She was not a killer, had never wanted to be one, and did not have the internal compulsion that had driven Dexter since childhood. What she had was a specific wound and a specific list of names, and she wanted to work through the list before whatever had been done to her finished the process of destroying who she had been before it started. She wanted the men dead, and she wanted to be there when it happened. Jordan Chase was the center of the group. He operated publicly as a self-help speaker, running seminars and selling recordings built around a philosophy that his audience heard as motivational and that he had always understood as something else. His catchphrase was, "Take it," a two-word instruction that meant, to the audiences paying for conference tickets and audio programs, that they should pursue their ambitions without hesitation. What it meant to Jordan, whose real name was Eugene Greer, and to the group he had assembled, was something that could not be said in front of an audience. The group had been doing what they did since they were young men, connected by an incident involving a girl named Emily Birch that had established the dynamic and the appetite and the pattern. Emily Birch had survived and knew every name. She became a key piece of what Dexter and Lumen were building. The other members of the group were Boyd Fowler, who was already dead, and Alex Tilden, Cole Harmon, and Dan Mendel. Dexter and Lumen worked through the list methodically, Lumen providing identifications that only a survivor of their specific crimes could provide, Dexter providing the logistics and the execution. The partnership had a quality of mutual competence that neither of them had found in other relationships. She was useful to him in ways that went beyond what any previous accomplice had been, and he was useful to her in ways that she acknowledged without sentiment. They were solving a problem together, and the solving of it was producing something that resembled care. Quinn was circling. His suspicion of Dexter had not diminished after the Bay Harbor butcher case closed, and Rita's murder under circumstances that matched Trinity's pattern, while Dexter could produce no reliable alibi, had given the suspicion a new direction. He was not doing this through official channels, which meant he had no real standing and no institutional support. He hired a private investigator named Stan Liddy to conduct surveillance on Dexter. Liddy photographed Dexter and Lumen on the boat, disposing of the remains of one of their targets. The photographs created a problem. Dexter addressed the problem by killing Liddy, who had confronted him directly on the boat, and the investigation effectively closed on itself when Liddy disappeared. The season's final stretch moved toward Jordan Chase. He was the last name on the list and the hardest to reach, a public figure whose schedule was managed and whose public identity provided insulation from the kind of approach Dexter typically used. Jordan understood that someone was working through the group and understood who was doing it. He abducted Deborah, who had been investigating the Barrel Girls case and had gotten close enough to the vigilante killings to become a target. He used her as leverage, bringing Dexter and Lumen to him on his terms rather than theirs. The final confrontation happened in a place Jordan had chosen, and it ended with Jordan dead and Deborah in the next room. Deborah found the kill room. She pushed through to where the plastic sheeting was still in place and looked at two figures moving inside it, visible only as shapes through the opaque surface. She could not see their faces. She could not identify who they were. She had been working the Barrel Girls case for weeks, and she understood what had happened in the room she was standing in. She let them go. The statement she made to colleagues afterward was that the vigilante killers had escaped before she arrived, and the case closed without arrests. After Jordan was dead, Lumen told Dexter something he had not anticipated. The darkness she had been carrying since her capture, the need she had described that had pulled her through the months of tracking and killing, was gone. She did not feel it anymore. She said it simply, without drama, as a fact about her own interior that she was reporting as accurately as she could. Whatever the killings had addressed in her, they had addressed it. She was not going to keep doing it. She was not a killer, and the killing was finished, and she needed to go home. She left. The season ended with Dexter standing in the space she had occupied, alone again in a way that was different from the aloneness before she arrived. He had known, during the months with Lumen, something that he had not been able to name while it was happening. Harry had appeared to him at the season's midpoint and told him that Lumen was the person who could see him completely, who knew every part of what he was, and still chose to stay. Harry said that some people searched their whole lives for that and never found it. Dexter had found it and lost it inside 12 months. He went back to the house with Harrison. The infant was older now, past the stage of pure sleepless chaos, beginning to develop the early signs of a distinct personality. Dexter watched him and thought about what he was watching. His son had been born in blood, the same way he had. Whatever came next would be shaped by that beginning, the same way everything in Dexter's life had been shaped by a shipping container and 2 days alone in the blood of his mother. The season had been about grief and partnership and the particular quality of connection that comes from being fully known by another person. Lumen had known him. She was gone. Harrison was still here. The question of what to do with that was the question the show would spend the next 3 seasons trying and mostly failing to answer. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Season 5 ended with Dexter more alone than he had been since the show began, and with Deborah closer to the truth than she had ever been without knowing it. Season 6 would push both of them further along those trajectories, and the storyline it arrived at by the finale would change the show permanently. Section 6: The End of Days. 4 dead bodies arrived on horseback into downtown Miami. Nathan Roberts had been killed, his remains divided and sewn onto mannequin frames, then set astride 4 horses released into traffic on a Tuesday morning. The body parts were arranged to recreate the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, staged as a crime scene, and delivered to the city like a message. Miami Metro had seen a great many things. This was new. Season 6 built its central case around a series of murders, staged as tableaus, each one referencing a different event described in the final book of the Christian Bible. The killers were identified early as Professor James Geller, a religious studies professor who had been investigated for the theft of an antique sword, supposedly belonging to John the Revelator, and Travis Marshall, his young former student who had become devoted to him. The show presented them as a pair, giving the audience scenes of both men planning and executing the tableaus together, building the case as a 2-person partnership driven by religious conviction and the belief that their actions were accelerating the end of days. They called themselves the 2 Witnesses, a concept from Revelation referring to 2 figures who would appear to herald the apocalypse. Miami Metro called them the Doomsday Killers, abbreviated to DDK in the department's files. The tableaus accumulated across the season with a visual ambition that the show had never previously attempted. A woman named Holly Benson was abducted and held captive in an abandoned church, chained and forced to drink blood, intended to represent the whore of Babylon. Travis had a moment of conscience and released her, still blindfolded, before the tableau was complete. His sister Lisa, who had raised Travis after their parents died and who represented everything stable and good in his life, was later killed and displayed outside her school with unknown text carved into her forehead and alligator heads arranged around her body, the completed version of the Whore of Babylon tableau. Travis had killed the person closest to him in the world to finish a piece of staging he believed God required. The Angel of Death killed a woman named Erin Bear, a date Travis had spent the night with, and then set up in an elaborate apparatus with makeshift wings attached to her back and a spiked collar around her throat. She was still alive when police found her. An officer moved toward her and triggered a tripwire that caused her to drop, the wings to spread, and the collar to close. She died at the scene. The mechanism had been built to ensure that the death happened in response to police intervention, rather than directly at Travis's hand. After Bear died, a cabinet nearby opened and released a swarm of locusts into the greenhouse where the scene had been staged. The Geller twist arrived at the season's midpoint and was the creative decision that defined how Season 6 was received and remembered. Dexter, having tracked the Doomsday investigation through the crime scene evidence while working it officially with Miami Metro, found his way to the abandoned church that Travis had been using. In the basement of the church, he found a freezer. Inside the freezer was the body of Professor James Geller, frozen, dead for some time. Geller had been dead the entire season. Every scene the audience had watched involving Geller giving instructions to Travis, responding to Travis, debating with Travis, had been a projection of Travis's own fractured mind. Travis had stabbed Geller early in the show's run with the sword of John the Revelator, attempting to prove that if they were genuinely the 2 witnesses described in Revelation, the sword would not kill him. It had. Travis had kept the body and kept talking to it, and the show had presented these conversations as real until the moment they were not. The twist did not land the way the writers had hoped. The problem was structural rather than tonal. The Geller is real deception required the show to withhold information from the audience in a way that felt, in retrospect, less like a mystery and more like a manipulation. Critics noted that the hints had been there throughout the season for viewers paying close attention, and that the reveal had been anticipated enough by parts of the audience that it could not deliver the shock it was designed to. The parallel between Travis and Geller as a dynamic and Dexter and Harry as a dynamic was genuinely interesting when examined after the fact. 2 men guided through their lives by the voice of a dead authority figure, one toward violence and one toward a code that constrained it. The parallel was not enough to rescue the season's central arc from the critical reception it received. Edward James Olmos had been brought in as Geller, partly because of his reputation, and partly because the character, as written, required someone whose presence was compelling enough to hold scenes without any other actor to work against. He delivered that presence. Colin Hanks as Travis Marshall played the fragility and the religious fervor and the grief over his sister with genuine commitment. The season's failure was not the fault of its cast. Outside the Doomsday Case, Season 6 carried several other threads that ran through the earlier episodes and shaped the show's direction going forward. Brother Sam was a former killer who had found religion and was running a body shop in Miami, employing other ex-convicts and leading a small congregation of people who were trying to build different lives from the ones they had been living. He was played by Yassine Bey, with a warmth and specificity that made the character feel real rather than symbolic. He was shot partway through the season by a man connected to his past life, and as he was dying, he told Dexter he needed to forgive the man who had shot him. He asked Dexter to find that person and forgive him. Dexter went to the hospital room of the shooter with a pillow in his hands and came out without having used it. He stood in the hallway and worked through what Brother Sam had asked, and found, somewhere in the calculation, that he could honor the request. He left the man alive. The Nebraska episode took Dexter out of Miami for a standalone chapter. News had reached him that Trinity's wife Sally and daughter Rebecca had been murdered in Nebraska, where the family had been relocated after Arthur's death. Jonah Mitchell, Arthur's son, was the suspected killer. Dexter drove to Nebraska, expecting to find a young man who had inherited his father's compulsion, a second Trinity beginning where the first had ended. What he found was more complicated. Rebecca had taken her own life, driven to it by the years of abuse she had experienced in that household, and by her mother's persistent tendency to blame the children for what Arthur had been. Jonah had found his sister dead, and had then killed his mother in a rage so complete that it matched, in method, the way Arthur had killed fathers of two for 30 years. Jonah had used the same blunt instrument, the same pattern of blows. The generational damage had expressed itself in a single violent act, and Jonah was left with the guilt of it and the grief of what had led to it simultaneously. Dexter let him go. He heard the full account and made a judgment that the code's threshold had not been met in the way that mattered, that Jonah was not what his father had been, and was not going to become it. He left Nebraska and drove back to Miami with something that felt, if not like mercy exactly, like the recognition that not every act of violence belongs to the same category. Deborah became the lieutenant of the homicide division during the season. The promotion was controversial inside Miami Metro and required her to navigate relationships with colleagues she had previously been equal to, people who responded to the change with varying degrees of support and resentment. Quinn's response was one of the more difficult. His relationship with Deborah had deteriorated from the point where he had proposed and she had said no, and the promotion added a professional layer to the personal distance that had been growing between them. He was drinking more and working less carefully, visible signs of a person struggling with something they were not addressing. Deborah's therapist was a woman who guided her carefully through the history of her relationships and the patterns she kept repeating. The therapy sessions built towards something the therapist eventually named, that the intensity of Deborah's bond with Dexter, the emotional centrality of that relationship in her life, the way it had shaped every other relationship she had tried to build, might reflect feelings that went beyond the sibling connection. Deborah resisted the characterization for several sessions. She came back to the therapist's office and resisted it again. Then she sat with it alone and stopped resisting it, and the show moved in the direction it had been building toward. The season's final episodes accelerated toward a conclusion that required Dexter to find and stop Travis before the last tableau could be completed. Travis had a woman named Beth Dorsey attempt to release a biological agent inside the Miami Metro building as a distraction, and Dexter intercepted her. He then went after Travis at a marina where Travis intended to complete his final scene, a tableau called The Lamb, and was one step behind him at every point. Travis kidnapped Harrison from his preschool. He took the child to a lake and prepared to sacrifice him, intending to complete the cycle of his tableaus with the death of a child as the culminating act. Dexter arrived in time, got Harrison away from Travis, and Travis escaped again. Travis returned to the church. Dexter found him there and killed him on the altar, the same physical space where Travis had conducted his services, where he had displayed the artifacts of his belief, where the whole theology that had driven his killing had been organized and maintained. The kill was without ceremony. Travis Marshall ended on an altar in a church in Miami, and that was the end of the Doomsday Killer case. Deborah had followed. She had been looking for Dexter and had found the church, and she walked through the door at the moment when the kill was finished. She stood in the entrance of the church and saw Dexter standing over Travis's body on the altar, saw the plastic sheeting and the arrangement and the specific aftermath of what had happened. She had seen what she was looking at. She stood there and looked at her brother and did not scream and did not run. The season ended on that image. Deborah in the doorway, Dexter at the altar, the distance between them containing everything the show had spent 6 years carefully maintaining. The secret had lasted 6 seasons. It had taken 6 seasons to get Deborah to a position where seeing the truth with her own eyes was possible. And the moment when she got there was the moment the show allowed itself to make the turn it had always known it would have to make. What came next, in Season 7, would be the consequence of 6 years of concealment finally encountering 6 years of love. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Season 6 ended with Deborah seeing Dexter kill. Season 7 began with the question of what she was going to do about it, and the answer the show gave was one of the most dramatically rich stretches of the original run's final years. Section 7, the truth comes out. Deborah had her gun drawn in the church. She was pointing it at her brother across the space that contained Travis Marshall's body and everything the last 6 years had been protecting. Dexter told her he had snapped, that Rita's death had been in his mind, that something broke loose. She started to accept it and then stopped and asked about the plastic sheeting. A man who killed in a sudden rage of grief did not stop to wrap a room in plastic first. She had spent years as a police officer. She knew what the plastic meant. She helped him burn the church anyway. She drove to a gas station 2 blocks away and filled a container while Dexter set the interior alight, and they left the building to burn with Travis Marshall's body inside it. Miami Metro arrived the following morning to a scorched building and charred remains that the department processed as Travis's final tableau, a self-immolation at the end of the world he had been trying to start. Everything pointed to that conclusion except for one thing: a blood slide that Dexter had dropped in his rush to clear the scene, left behind on the church floor, recovered by LaGuerta, and quietly pocketed before it entered the official evidence chain. Deborah went to Dexter's apartment the next day and searched it. She found the knives in their case and the collection box of blood slides and stood in the room with these things in her hands and then called him. When he arrived, she asked him directly, using exactly the words she had, whether he was a serial killer. He said yes. The show had spent 6 seasons building to that conversation, and it lasted less than a scene in screen time. There was no extended confession, no detailed account of every kill, no breakdown from either of them in the immediate moment. He said yes, and she absorbed the answer with the particular quality of someone who had been carrying a partially formed version of that answer for years, without letting themselves complete it. She took him into the police station the following day and told him she was going to get him to confess, that she was going to give him the chance to do the right thing before she did anything else. Dexter had anticipated the move and had arranged things such that the interrogation went nowhere productive, and the attempt to bring him in through official channels collapsed without gaining traction. LaGuerta, watching from a distance, started asking questions. The blood slide she had taken from the church scene went to a private laboratory rather than Miami Metro's official forensics process. The results confirmed that the blood on the slide belonged to Travis Marshall. LaGuerta had also researched the Bay Harbor Butcher case's evidence collection practices and established something the original investigation had never addressed. The Miami Metro forensics team did not take blood slides from crime scenes. The slide found in the church was identical in construction to the butcher's trophy slides. LaGuerta connected these 2 facts and stopped treating the Bay Harbor Butcher case as closed. Isaac Sirko arrived in Miami at the same time that LaGuerta's investigation was beginning. He came from the Koshka Brotherhood, a Ukrainian organized crime organization that operated strip clubs and other businesses across Miami, and he had a specific purpose: finding out what had happened to Victor Baskov. Victor had been a Brotherhood operative who had murdered a Miami Metro detective named Mike Anderson during the season's first episode, and Dexter had killed Victor shortly afterward when connecting him to Anderson's death. Isak was the head of the Brotherhood's operations. He was also, as the season eventually made clear, the person who had loved Victor in a way that went beyond professional loyalty. Victor had been his partner in the fullest sense, and when Victor disappeared, Isak did not send an accountant to assess the situation. Ray Stevenson played Isaac with a refinement and precision that made him one of the most watchable antagonists the show had produced since Trinity. He was cultured and calm, and extraordinarily dangerous, and he had no interest in pretense with Dexter once he identified him as Victor's killer. He killed 3 members of the Brotherhood who were operating in Miami as a demonstration of what he was capable of, and went to prison for it, temporarily neutralizing the threat he posed, while the Brotherhood sent their own operatives to kill Dexter in the meantime. Dexter survived multiple attempts across the weeks of Isaac's incarceration. When Isaac was released, the dynamic between the two men shifted into something the show had not previously offered: a sustained conversation between Dexter and a genuinely intelligent opponent who saw him clearly and found him interesting. They reached a working détente when their respective problems aligned briefly, each needing the other to manage a threat that was more immediately pressing than the threat they posed to each other. The Brotherhood had decided that Isak was a liability because of his pursuit of personal revenge over organizational efficiency. They sent killers after him. Dexter killed them first, not out of affection for Isak, but out of practical calculation. Isak died on Dexter's boat. He had been shot and was bleeding out, and the two of them sat on the water while it happened. Isak talked about Victor. He said he had known when he came to Miami that he would die here, that the pursuit of revenge for someone he loved was always going to end this way, and that he had made the choice with full understanding. He told Dexter that what he was searching for, the thing that made him delay killing targets and study them and look for something in them he could not name, was the same thing Isak had found in Victor. He said Dexter was looking for someone who could see all of what he was. He slipped the water over the side of the boat, and Dexter was left with the conversation. Hannah McKay had entered Dexter's life through a homicide case involving a serial killer named Wayne Randall. She had traveled with Randall years earlier and had helped lead police to the locations of his victims after he was captured. She was a botanist who cultivated exotic plants, and she was beautiful in a way that the show was not subtle about. And when Dexter analyzed the crime scenes she led investigators to, he found one body that had been killed differently from the others. The manner of death pointed to poison, not to Randall's method. The victim had been killed by someone who understood plants and their chemical properties in ways that a drifter, with no botanical education, did not. He planned to kill her and could not do it. He brought her to a kill room with the table prepared and the M99 ready, and stood in front of her and found that the calculation that had always run cleanly when it reached its conclusion was stalling. She was not afraid of him. She sat in the room and looked at him with the quality of a person who had dealt with dangerous situations before and who had decided, sometime before entering the room, how she was going to handle this particular one. She talked to him. He did not inject her. He let her go. Their relationship ran through the second half of the season as the most honest connection Dexter had formed since Lumen. Hannah knew what he was before they were together, in the way that Lumen had known, but Hannah was not seeking resolution the way Lumen had been. She was simply someone who had a complicated history with violence, and who did not find Dexter's nature frightening because she had already made her own accommodations with darkness. They were together in the straightforward sense, going on dates, spending nights together, letting Harrison spend time with them. Harrison liked her. Deborah's response to the relationship was not straightforward. She had spent the season in an evolving relationship with the truth about her brother, moving from horror to attempted intervention to a grudging form of acceptance that was not fully acceptance, but was the closest she could manage. The romantic feelings that therapy had identified in season 6 had been immediately suppressed by the church discovery, replaced by something more primal and harder to categorize: a need to protect Dexter that overrode almost everything else she valued. The Hannah situation put that protection in conflict with her professional judgment and her personal safety. She was right to be wary of Hannah. Hannah poisoned her. The poison was administered through water Deborah drank during one of their interactions. It caused a dissociative episode while Deborah was driving, and she crashed her car. She was hospitalized. Dexter analyzed what had happened and recognized the botanical signature of what had been in her system. He went to Hannah's greenhouse and confirmed his reading of the evidence and sat with what it meant, that the person he had been closest to since Lumen had tried to kill his sister. The code applied in a direction he had not anticipated. Deborah, once she recovered and understood what had happened, did not wait for Dexter to resolve it. She found evidence that Hannah had killed a specific individual from her past, a victim outside the Randall case, and she used information Dexter had given her about Hannah's activities to build a case. She had Hannah arrested at the end of the season and delivered the arrest with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for the appropriate mechanism. LaGuerta's investigation had been building throughout all of this, quiet and methodical, adding pieces at intervals while the department's attention was elsewhere. She had security footage of Deborah filling a gas can 2 blocks from the church 22 minutes before it burned. She had obtained GPS warrants for the cell phones of both Dexter and Deborah for the night of Travis Marshall's death. She had brought Deborah into her confidence earlier in the season, asking for help clearing Dokes' name, and Deborah had navigated those conversations while managing what she knew from the other side of them. By the finale, LaGuerta had enough evidence to move. Dexter constructed a situation he calculated would remove LaGuerta from the problem permanently. Hector Estrada, the drug kingpin who had ordered the murder of Laura Moser decades earlier, had been released from prison on a legal technicality. Dexter found Estrada and staged an arrangement. He would bring Estrada to a shipping container, the same environment where his mother had died, and create circumstances that would make LaGuerta appear to have arranged an unauthorized operation that went wrong. He brought Estrada to the container. LaGuerta arrived. Then Deborah arrived. The finale, titled Surprise Motherfucker, named for the line James Dokes had delivered in this franchise's most remembered moment, brought all 3 of them into the container together. LaGuerta had a gun. She pointed it at Dexter and told Deborah that she needed to make a choice, that Dexter was not who she thought he was, that she was a good person and her brother was not. She asked Deborah to shoot him. Dexter put his arms up and told Deborah to do what she had to do. He meant it genuinely. He was willing to let her choose. He had told her that many times across the season, in various forms, that he would not make the choice for her. Deborah chose him. She shot LaGuerta, and then she went to her and held her and screamed in a way that Jennifer Carpenter apparently improvised in the room, unrehearsed, the sound of a person who had just stepped off the edge of the person they had been. LaGuerta died in the container. Deborah looked at Dexter and mouthed words that the camera caught and the audience read. She said, "I hate you." Batista, who had been planning to retire and open a restaurant, canceled those plans after LaGuerta's death. He had loved her across their complicated history, through the marriage and the divorce and everything after, and the loss re-anchored him to the department in a way that the coming season would build on. The show's 7th season was critically praised as the strongest work since season 4, the closest the later run had come to the tension and the moral seriousness of the show's best years. The finale had delivered the consequence the show had been deferring since season 2. The person closest to Dexter had been destroyed by the gravity of what he was. It had taken a different form than expected. It had destroyed her rather than him, and she was still alive, which in some ways was worse. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Season 7 ended with Deborah having crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and LaGuerta dead on a container floor. Season 8 arrived as the show's final season, carrying the weight of needing to conclude everything, and the manner in which it chose to do that would define the franchise's legacy for a decade. Section 8, The End of Everything. At a crime scene early in Season 8, Dr. Evelyn Vogel walked up to Dexter and handed him a drawing, a child sitting in a pool of blood with a larger figure standing over him. She had files on him from childhood, video recordings of her sessions with Harry, and she knew exactly what Dexter was before he could decide how to respond. She told him they needed to talk, and the calmness of it made clear she had never been afraid of him. Charlotte Rampling played Vogel as someone who had spent her professional life in the company of psychopaths and had developed, through that proximity, a way of being in a room with them that was neither afraid nor pretending. She was a world-renowned neuropsychiatrist who had spent decades studying the minds of people who killed, and she had come to Miami because someone was leaving sections of human brain tissue at her door as a message. The anterior insular cortex, specifically, the part of the brain that processes empathy. The brain surgeon was removing that section from each of his victims with surgical precision and delivering pieces of it to the woman he considered his audience. She told Dexter what she was, and what she had been, to the history he had been told was entirely Harry's. Harry had come to her when Dexter was a child, bringing the boy's file and his own fear of what he was watching develop. Harry had the instinct that the code was necessary and the law enforcement experience to understand what it needed to accomplish. Vogel had the psychological framework to make it work, to understand which elements of Dexter's psychology could be shaped and which could not, to design a structure that would hold. She told Dexter that Harry could not have done it without her. She told him she had watched him from a distance across his entire adult life, and that he was her greatest professional success. The proof that her theories about channeling psychopathic compulsion toward constructive ends were correct. She called herself his spiritual mother. Dexter received this information with a quality of attention that was more unsettled than he showed outwardly. He had spent his entire life believing the code was Harry's, that the father who had found him and adopted him and shaped him had also been the sole architect of the framework he lived inside. Learning that the framework had been designed by a third party, that Harry had gone to an expert because he did not know what he was doing, changed the texture of something Dexter had always taken as foundational. She gave him recordings of Harry's sessions with her. He watched them and saw his father frightened and uncertain in ways the ghost of Harry had never appeared. Deborah began the season in pieces. The months since the container had not been good ones. She had left Miami Metro and was working for a private investigator named Jacob Elway, doing surveillance work that required none of the skills she had spent her career developing and offered none of the purpose that detective work had given her. She was using drugs. She was sleeping with men she did not care about. She had constructed, in the year since killing LaGuerta, a version of her life that punished her for what she had done, without actually addressing what she had done. She told Dexter, early in the season, that she thought she would be better off if he were dead, a statement she walked back, but that contained enough truth for it to stick. She tried to get Dexter killed during the season. She made contact with a Koshka Brotherhood associate and provided information about Dexter's location with the intent of allowing the Brotherhood to finish what Isak Sirko had started. The attempt failed. She then spent the middle section of the season cycling through various states of wanting to protect Dexter and wanting to be free of him, a person in whom the two impulses were permanently and exhaustingly at war. By the time the season reached its final stretch, she had reconnected with Miami Metro and with some version of her professional identity, and the relationship with Dexter had returned to something closer to what it had always been, complicated and irreplaceable. The brain surgeon case built toward its conclusion through the season's middle episodes. An early suspect was eliminated, and the investigation narrowed to a man named Oliver Saxon, who was connected to one of Vogel's patients. Dexter worked backward from Saxon's history and found the truth. Oliver Saxon was not his real name. His real name was Daniel Vogel, and he was Evelyn's son. He had drowned his younger brother Richard in the family swimming pool as a child, killing him out of jealousy, and had been institutionalized by his parents. He had eventually caused a fire in the psychiatric facility that killed 7 other children and had used the chaos to escape, taking the identity of the real Oliver Saxon and building a new life. He had eventually arrived in Miami, where his mother lived, and had begun leaving pieces of his victim's brains at her door as a greeting. Vogel knew when she found out who the brain surgeon was. The knowledge put her in a position she had not anticipated when she came to Miami asking Dexter for help. The target of her investigation was her own son, and she found that her reaction to knowing this was more complicated than the clinical framework she had built her career on could easily accommodate. She wanted to protect him. She met with Saxon secretly and tried to reach him in a way that the evidence of his entire adult life suggested was not possible. She believed that her understanding of psychopathy, her expertise, would allow her to manage a situation that her expertise had told her for decades could not be managed. Saxon killed her at a dinner table. Dexter was there. Saxon produced a knife during what had appeared to be a meal and cut Evelyn Vogel's throat before Dexter could cross the room. She bled out in front of him as he held her, the woman who had designed his code and called herself his spiritual mother, killed by the person who represented the version of her work that had failed. Saxon left. Dexter was left in a room with what remained. The season also contained a storyline that Vogel had suggested as a parallel project to the brain surgeon investigation. A young man named Zach Hamilton, whose behavior had attracted attention, a wealthy family's son with no history of diagnosed disorder, and a clear emerging compulsion toward violence. Vogel believed the code could be applied to him the way it had been applied to Dexter. Dexter was skeptical, and then gradually not skeptical, working with Zach in the way that Harry had worked with him, testing the rules, and watching how Zach responded to structure. Zach showed genuine progress. He was then killed by Saxon, his brain removed in the same way as the brain surgeon's other victims, and the apprenticeship project ended before it could prove or disprove anything about whether what Harry and Vogel had done with Dexter could be replicated. Hannah McKay had escaped from custody and returned to Dexter's life at the season's midpoint. She arrived in Miami without announcement, surfacing through a connection to a man she had been involved with in the period since her arrest, and she and Dexter resumed their relationship with the particular ease of people who had been honest with each other about fundamental things from the beginning. The plan that developed between them across the season's second half was Argentina. They would take Harrison and go, build something entirely new in a country where their histories were not attached to them, and Dexter would leave behind the blood slides and the kill room and the code, and become whatever was left of him without those things. The plan was not simply escape. For Dexter, the Argentina plan was the closest thing the season offered to a genuine reckoning with whether he wanted to keep being what he was. He had spent 8 seasons operating on the logic that the Dark Passenger was permanent and unchosen, that the code was the best available structure for something that could not be removed. The Argentina plan was built on a different premise, that enough distance and enough love and enough forward motion might function as a substitute for what killing had always provided. He did not know if it would work. He was willing to try. Saxon shot Deborah at the hospital where she was being treated for a separate wound. He found her there and shot her as payback for the interference she represented. She was hospitalized again, in critical condition, and her initial stabilization suggested she would recover. The doctors were cautious, but not without hope. Dexter managed what needed to be managed. He found Saxon, handed him to Miami Metro rather than killing him, and delivered him into the official system while the plan for Argentina moved forward, with Harrison already at the airport with Hannah. Then, he went back to the Miami Metro building and walked into the interrogation room where Saxon was being held. The camera and the evidence and the official record of the session were all running. He had a ballpoint pen in his hand. He killed Saxon with it, driving it into the man's neck, in a room that was being monitored by Quinn in the adjacent observation area. Quinn watched what happened. He made a decision about what to put in his report. He wrote that Saxon had grabbed the pen first, that the killing had been in self-defense, and he closed the record of the session in a way that protected the man he had spent years trying to catch, doing exactly this kind of thing. Dexter went to Deborah's room to say goodbye. She had suffered a catastrophic complication during surgery, a massive stroke that left her brain dead, kept alive only by the machines in the room with her. The doctors told him what the situation was. He sat with it and made the calculation that the code had always made. What was the right thing to do for the person in front of him? He disconnected her from the life support. He wheeled her out of the hospital through a service exit, moving through the building with the precision and the calm that he brought to every difficult task, and he took her to his boat. He drove the slice of life into Hurricane Laura. The storm had been named Laura, the same name as his biological mother, and whether this was intentional in the writer's room or a coincidence that the show chose not to comment on has never been definitively established. The boat was destroyed in the storm. Dexter was presumed dead. Harrison and Hannah were already on a plane. The news of Dexter's death reached the people who had known him in Miami and closed the investigation that LaGuardia had never been able to finish. The final scene of the original series showed a man in a flannel shirt sitting inside a small house in the Pacific Northwest. He was surrounded by gray landscape and cold light, the deliberate opposite of Miami's heat and color. He looked into the camera directly. The season that had spent 12 episodes building toward a conclusion had arrived at a man in a flannel shirt in Oregon, alive, alone, with an expression that the show offered without commentary. The critical response was comprehensive in its rejection. The AV Club awarded the finale the grade of F, the lowest in the show's history. Fraser Moore of the Associated Press called the ending sappy, sloppy, and a cop-out. Richard Lawson in The Atlantic called it unbelievably unsatisfying, an ending that damaged what had preceded it by refusing to follow through on any of the show's central questions. Variety published under the headline of a sloppy send-off. Michael C. Hall said in the months afterward that reading the finale script had produced in him a feeling he described as sadness. Producer John Goldwyn confirmed in subsequent interviews that Showtime had vetoed any ending in which Dexter died, wanting to preserve the character's commercial availability for future projects. The Lumberjack in Oregon was the product of a network's refusal to let a story end, and a showrunner's inability, within those constraints, to find an alternative that satisfied what 8 seasons had been building toward. Deborah Morgan died. Harrison Morgan flew to South America with a woman his father loved. James Dokes remained officially the Bay Harbor Butcher. Maria LaGuardia had died in a shipping container, trying to prove she was right. Frank Lundy had never officially solved the case he spent his career pursuing. The credits rolled over all of it, and the show was over. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The original series ended with a finale that damaged its own legacy, and the franchise spent the next decade figuring out what to do about it. What happened when the story came back, and what it looked like when it finally got the ending it had been working toward, is what the final stretch covers. Section 9, New Blood Jim Lindsay, had been living in Iron Lake, New York for 10 years without killing anyone. He sold hunting equipment at a sporting goods store, attended AA meetings, and dated the local police chief. The cold and the smallness of the town had been deliberate choices, a place where anonymity was impossible and the dark passenger had almost nowhere to move. The town was Iron Lake, fictional in name, but built from the specific character of small-town upstate New York, a population under 3,000, a frozen lake at its center, a community where everyone knew everyone, and gaps in someone's history were noticed. Dexter Morgan had chosen it because it was everything Miami was not. The cold had been deliberate. The isolation had been deliberate. The smallness of the social world, where anonymity was impossible and pretense required constant maintenance, had been deliberate in its own way, a constraint he had built into the life to keep himself honest. The thing that had always threatened to consume him needed room and darkness and opportunity. Iron Lake offered very little of any of those. The production filmed the 10 episodes largely across central and western Massachusetts, with the town of Shelburne Falls standing in for Iron Lake's main streets over a 119-day shoot that ran during the tail end of COVID restrictions. The white moose appeared in the first episode. It moved through the snow at the edge of a forest near the lake, and Dexter tracked it with a rifle for a long time, holding it in his sights, before lowering the weapon and walking away. The moment was not about the moose. It was about whether the 10 years of Jim Lindsay had actually changed anything fundamental, or whether the compulsion was still underneath everything, waiting for the right pressure. He let the moose go. That answer lasted about 40 minutes of screen time before a man named Matt Caldwell changed the arithmetic. Kurt Caldwell was the unofficial mayor of Iron Lake. He had driven big rigs for years, the same as his father before him, and had leveraged that beginning into ownership of several trucks and the local truck stop, which served as a hub for the community in the way that small-town institutions do. He was generous with his money, present at every local event, quick with a favor, and apparently genuine in his affection for the place and the people. Clancy Brown played him with the particular quality of someone whose warmth is real and whose darkness is also real, both existing without apparent contradiction. Kurt was the show's answer to the question of what Arthur Mitchell looked like in a colder setting, a pillar of his community who was also systematically hunting and killing young women who stopped at his truck stop, preserving their bodies and keeping them in a room at his cabin as a private collection that nobody else had ever seen. Matt Caldwell was Kurt's son, the entitled and largely unpleasant inheritor of the Caldwell name in Iron Lake. He got drunk and shot the white moose, which was sacred to the local Seneca Nation, whose traditions were woven through the community's identity. The act produced outrage, and the investigation into it produced contact between Matt and Dexter at a moment when Dexter had been in the process of killing someone else. Matt witnessed enough to understand what he had stumbled into. Dexter killed him. The killing of Matt Caldwell was the first domino. It brought Kurt's attention to the question of what had happened to his son, drew the investigation in directions that intersected with Dexter's identity, and set in motion everything the season built toward. Kurt's grief over his son was genuine, which was one of the things that made him complicated. The killer who hunted women through the woods was also a father whose love for his specific child was not performed. He hired people to find out what had happened to Matt. He eventually discovered the truth, and the season's second half became the story of two killers circling each other in a small enough town that the circle kept getting tighter. Angela Bishop had been living with the missing women problem longer than anyone in Iron Lake knew about. Her childhood friend Iris had disappeared decades earlier, and the disappearance had been inadequately investigated, quietly closed, and allowed to become part of the category of things that small communities absorb without resolution. Angela had not absorbed it. She had been quietly assembling information across years, maintaining a case that had no official status, and the arrival of true crime podcaster Molly Park in Iron Lake gave the investigation a new source of energy. Molly was not investigating the missing women case specifically. She had come for the Matt Caldwell story. But her particular quality of attention and her willingness to follow threads wherever they led pulled the focus toward the long-standing pattern that Angela had been tracking alone. The investigation eventually intersected with the Bay Harbor butcher case through a specific forensic detail: the drug used to sedate victims. M99, an animal tranquilizer, had appeared in multiple cold cases across different states, always in circumstances that matched the Bay Harbor butcher's method. Angela was sharp enough to connect the thread and tenacious enough to pull it, and what it led toward was a profile that matched the man she knew as Jim Lindsay. She did not leap immediately to that conclusion. She built toward it carefully, cross-referencing, second-guessing herself, going back to the evidence when the instinct felt too close to conspiracy thinking. The evidence kept confirming what she had not wanted to find. Harrison Morgan arrived in Iron Lake not long after the season began. He had been 18 years old and living with the specific quality of damage that comes from spending a childhood among people who do not fully know what to do with a child, shaped the way Harrison had been shaped. He had tracked his father down through methods the season did not fully explain, arriving in town without announcement, presenting himself to Jim Lindsay in the sporting goods store with the kind of directness that belongs to young people who have been waiting a long time to say something. Dexter's response to the arrival was a visible recalibration. The entire construction of Jim Lindsay depended on the assumption that this moment would not come, and here it was. Jack Alcott played Harrison as a young man whose surface was readable in some ways and entirely opaque in others. He was charming when he wanted to be, and volatile when he did not, and his body carried the particular held quality of someone who had learned early that strong feelings were better managed than expressed. He had scars on his torso that he initially explained as an accident. They were not an accident. He had been using a blade on himself, the self-harm expressing something about his own interior that he had not found another language for. Dexter recognized what he was looking at when he understood the full picture. He was looking at himself, partially, in a different form. Their relationship across the season was the most honest father-son dynamic the show had managed to write. The original Harry-Dexter relationship had always been filtered through retrospect and mythology, built from flashbacks and the ghost's edited memory of events. Dexter and Harrison in Iron Lake had no mythology to fall back on. They were two damaged people in a cold town trying to establish whether any kind of real connection was possible between them, with no precedent and no template. Dexter had never been a father in the meaningful sense. Harrison had never had a father in any consistent sense. The show gave them the season to work through that, and the working through was not comfortable. Deborah's ghost was different from Harry's. Where Harry had appeared across 8 seasons as a counsel, a voice that advised and occasionally challenged, but was fundamentally oriented toward helping Dexter navigate his situation, Deborah came back as something more complicated. Jennifer Carpenter's return in that form was one of New Blood's most effective decisions. The voice and the presence, and the specific quality of Deborah's directness, applied now from inside Dexter's own head, with all the weight of what her death had meant. She did not advise, she challenged. She asked him things he did not want to answer. She represented not the code, but the consequence of the code, the damage it had done to the people closest to him. And she was not interested in helping him manage that damage. She was interested in whether he would finally look at it clearly. Harrison had dark impulses of his own. The season made this clear through his behavior at school, where he intervened in a situation involving a friend and Ethan with a level of violence that exceeded what the situation required, and that he did not appear to regret in the normal way. Dexter recognized the signature. He began considering what Harry had considered when he recognized Dexter's signature, and he arrived at the same crossroads. Try to suppress it, or try to build a structure around it. He started teaching Harrison the code. The parallel to Harry teaching young Dexter was intentional and uncomfortable. The show was asking directly whether Dexter was making the same mistake Harry had made, whether teaching someone to channel their compulsion toward acceptable targets was a gift or a trap, whether the code was a solution or a way of ensuring that the problem passed to the next generation in a more organized form. Deborah's ghost was the voice that kept asking these questions. Dexter did not have good answers. Kurt's serial killing was being uncovered layer by layer while all of this was happening. Angela found Iris's body in a mine, confirmation that her instinct about what had happened to her childhood friend had been right all along. The discovery of the trophy room at Kurt's cabin, the preserved bodies of the women he had killed across decades, was the kind of evidence that closed cases and changed the shape of what a community thought it knew about itself. Iron Lake had believed Kurt Caldwell was its most reliable citizen. Iron Lake had been wrong about this for a very long time. Angel Batista flew in from Miami following the M99 connection that Angela had developed. He arrived in Iron Lake as a veteran homicide investigator who had worked the Bay Harbor butcher case from inside the department that had attributed it to Dokes. When he encountered Jim Lindsay in person, something moved across his face that the scene held for a moment. He had known Dexter Morgan for years. He was looking at Dexter Morgan. The connection was not formalized immediately, but it was there, and his presence in town represented exactly the kind of pressure from Dexter's past that the Jim Lindsay construction had been designed to prevent. Dexter killed Kurt in the season's penultimate stretch, wrapping the Caldwell case in the way he had always wrapped cases, methodically, in plastic, with a slide. The kill settled the immediate problem of Kurt and the women and the trophy room. It did not settle the Angela problem, which by that point had moved from investigation to certainty. She arrested Dexter on the Bay Harbor butcher charge, bringing him into custody with the specific quality of a person who had loved someone and discovered what they actually were. Julia Jones played Angela's confrontation with what she knew, with a stillness that the scene required, the horror and the grief and the professional necessity, all present simultaneously, none of them winning. Harrison helped Dexter escape. He understood by that point what his father was, and had chosen, provisionally and with significant ambivalence, to stay in proximity to that rather than run from it, the way Dexter had run from his own life for 10 years. The escape from custody brought them together into the woods outside Iron Lake, in a final stretch that the production had filmed in the second week of shooting, long before the rest of the season had been captured. Clyde Phillips and director Marco Siega had both said publicly in subsequent interviews that the decision about how the season would end was made before the first scene of the third episode was filmed. They had worked backward from the ending. The ending was that Harrison shot his father. Dexter had been moving through the season toward a recognition that his specific brand of self-examination could be stated simply. He was the problem. Not the code, not the dark passenger, not the structure Harry and Vogel had built around a compulsion that neither of them had caused. He was the problem. Every person he had been close to had been damaged or destroyed by the specific gravity of what he was. Rita, Deborah, Lumen, Harrison, standing in front of him now with a rifle and a history that was partly Dexter's fault, and partly Harry's fault, and partly Arthur Mitchell's fault, and partly just the universe's particular cruelty. The damage had passed from generation to generation, the way damage does. And Dexter had spent 10 years in Iron Lake, pretending that running away from Miami had interrupted the transmission. It had not. He told Harrison he needed to stop. He said it clearly, not as a statement about Harrison specifically, but about the whole arc of what Dexter Morgan had been and done and cost. He was not asking Harrison to shoot him in any explicit sense. He was saying something true about himself and about what would happen if he continued, and Harrison heard what was underneath the words, and Harrison made his own calculation. The shot came from a hunting rifle. Dexter fell in the snow and bled. Harrison stood over him. The scene had none of the ceremony of a kill room, and none of the code's precision. It was a son and his father in the snow in the cold, and the son was the one still standing when it was done. Harrison turned himself in to Angela. She knew enough of what had happened and what Dexter had been to understand the full shape of the situation, and she made the decision that a police chief in a small town, who had just lost someone she loved, makes when the official version of events and the true version are different enough that the truth cannot be fully told. She let Harrison go. He drove away from Iron Lake in the gray morning light, and the season ended on that departure rather than on his father's body in the snow. New Blood averaged more than 8 million weekly viewers across all platforms across its 10-episode run, the highest average in Showtime's history. The finale drew 3 million viewers on the night of broadcast. The show had brought the audience back in numbers the original series had never achieved in its peak years, a demonstration that the desire to see Dexter Morgan's story properly concluded was as strong in 2021 as it had been in 2006. Clyde Phillips described the internet's reaction to the specific ending as hating it. He said he made the ending anyway because he believed it was right, and because Hall had wanted it, and because the alternative was leaving the character in the position of having escaped again. He had not escaped this time. For the first time in the franchise's history, Dexter Morgan lay in the snow rather than driving into a hurricane, and the man who had made that happen was his son, and the damage had finally circled back to its source. Then the story continued. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. New Blood delivered the ending the franchise had been denying itself for 8 years, and then the franchise declined to accept it. What came next expanded the story in 2 directions at once, backward into Dexter's past and forward into his survival, and together, those 2 directions constitute where the story stands right now. Section 10. Going back, moving forward. The first thing Original Sin showed was not 1991 Miami, but a hospital emergency room in upstate New York. Dexter Morgan had been shot by his son and was being rushed into surgery, his heart barely holding on. As the doctors worked, his life replayed from the beginning. Then the screen cut to 1991, and a 20-year-old version of him stepped into the story. The conceit was elegant in its simplicity. Hall's narration continued throughout Original Sin as the voice inside the young man's head, the older Dexter recounting his origins from the vantage point of someone who had lived through all of it, who was lying in a hospital bed letting the story replay. Patrick Gibson played the 1991 version, Hall voiced the narration, and the 2 halves of the performance were divided across a 34-year gap in the character's life. Gibson had the physical presence of the role, the stillness, and the deliberate movement, and Hall's voice stitched the two performances together in a way that made the transition between them feel less like a replacement and more like a continuation. Christian Slater played Harry Morgan as a living man rather than a ghost, and the specific difference that made was significant. The Harry that 8 seasons of the original show had given the audience was a constructed memory, edited by guilt and devotion, and the particular distortions that happen when a person becomes a kind of mythology to the one who loved them. Original Sin's Harry was a working detective in the Miami Metro Homicide Division in 1991, a man with a heart condition and a difficult marriage behind him, and 2 children he was figuring out how to raise after the death of his wife Doris. Slater brought to the role a quality of fallibility that James Remar's Ghost had never quite had, the sense of a man making decisions in real time without the benefit of knowing how they would turn out, uncertain and devoted, and occasionally wrong. Harry, in this version, was doing his best with an impossible situation. That was not always the same as doing the right thing. The 1991 Miami setting gave the show its own particular visual character. The city was warmer and more chaotic in the early 90s. Pre-gentrification, a different color palette, and a different energy from the Miami of the original series. Dexter was 20 years old, a student who had been training towards surgery and who had just begun a forensic internship at Miami Metro. He was already carefully managed in his social presentation, already running the performance of a normal person who found the things other people found in the expected situations, already containing something that had no outlet and was pressing harder every day. The hair was different, longer, and somewhat improbable in a way that the show was aware of and moved past quickly. The eyes were the same. Nurse Mary was Harry's would-be killer. She had been administering a slow poison to the patients in her care for years, selecting them by some internal criterion that the investigation had not yet reached, and Harry was in her hospital being treated for his heart condition when the pattern became visible to the people looking. Harry told Dexter. He did not simply ask his son to investigate. He told Dexter to kill her, gave him explicit permission and instruction to do what the code was being designed to make possible, and sent him into the hospital to do it. The first kill happened with Harry's knowledge and at Harry's request, which was both a retcon of what the original series had implied about the timeline and a meaningful recontextualization of the code's origins. Harry had not simply taught Dexter to channel an existing compulsion. He had asked his son to use it, specifically, for the first time. Young Dexter took an earring as a trophy. He had not yet developed the blood slide ritual, had not yet arrived at the specific method that would define his collection across 8 seasons and into middle age. The earring was a different kind of marker, an earlier iteration of the impulse to commemorate, and the narration noted with dark humor that he would later regret the choice of trophy. The blood slides came afterward, refined by experience into something more precise and less risky than a piece of jewelry taken from a victim. The other characters in Original Sin occupied the Miami Metro of 1991 with their own early versions. Christina Milian played a younger Maria LaGuerta before the career maneuvering and the political calculations that defined the character in the original series. Here simply an ambitious detective at the beginning of her climb. James Martinez played Angel Batista before the warmth had fully settled, a younger man in an early stage of the profession. Alex Shimizu played a younger Masuka, his particular combination of technical brilliance and social bluntness already fully formed in outline even at the beginning. Reno Wilson played a young James Dokes, and the choice to show the character as a rookie gave the performance a specific poignancy, knowing what the audience knew about where that life was going to end up. Sarah Michelle Gellar appeared as Tanya Martin, the CSI chief at Miami Metro, Dexter's direct supervisor during his forensic internship. The household dynamic was the prequel's strongest element. Doris had just died, and the Morgan home was running on grief and obligation, Harry managing his own loss while also managing the children and the job. Teenage Deborah was played by Molly Brown, with the particular rawness of a young person who had not yet found the specific register in which Deborah Morgan would eventually express herself, still developing toward the version that Jennifer Carpenter would inhabit. The season spent time in the domestic life of the Morgan home, in a way the original series could only gesture toward in flashback, showing how that family had actually functioned, and where the specific textures of each character's adult psychology had come from. The opening credits for Original Sin recreated the morning routine in the Morgan household rather than in Dexter's apartment, because in 1991, there was no apartment. Harry shaved. Young Deborah painted her nails. Young Dexter moved through his morning with all the same recontextualizing close-ups the original sequence had used, the crime scene photography framing that made ordinary things read as sinister. And when the mosquito landed on his arm, young Dexter swatted at it and missed. Clyde Phillips had been specific about the meaning of that miss. He had not learned yet. The precision that would define him for the next 3 decades was still being developed. Original Sin premiered on December 13th, 2024, and immediately became the most watched premiere in Showtime's history, with 2.1 million viewers on its first night. The reviews were solidly positive without being effusive, a 70% critical score on the aggregator, a 78% audience score, the response of people who found the prequel competent and affectionate, and occasionally more than that, without quite reaching the heights of what the original series had achieved in its best seasons. Gibson's performance received consistent praise. The particular challenge of playing a character that an audience associated deeply with a specific other actor was one that he navigated with enough care and enough distinctiveness to earn his own relationship with the role, rather than simply approximating Hall's. A renewal for a second season was announced in April 2025, 6 weeks after the first season's finale had aired. Then came the Skydance-Paramount merger and the change in executive leadership at Showtime, and in August 2025, Variety reported that despite the renewal announcement, no writer's room had ever been opened and no production dates had ever been set. Original Sin was quietly canceled. The new leadership at Paramount had looked at the franchise and decided that 2 simultaneous Dexter Morgan storylines were diluting the brand, and that the resources and the attention should be concentrated on Michael C. Hall's continued presence as the character rather than on a parallel prequel with a different actor. Patrick Gibson's version of Dexter Morgan ended at 1 season, his story reaching the point where the code had been activated and the first kill had been made, and then stopping there. The decision was not made in a creative vacuum. Dexter: Resurrection had premiered on July 11, 2025, and the reception it received immediately changed the conversation about where the franchise should be directing its energy. The premiere drew 4.4 million multi-platform viewers in its first week, a figure that placed it among the most significant cable premieres of the year. Reviews came in, and the aggregated critical score reached and then held at 95%, the highest the franchise had achieved across any of its entries, and the first time since the 4th season that the critical and popular responses were pointing in the same direction simultaneously. The IMDb audience score reached 9.0, placing the season briefly inside that platform's top 35 most highly rated television series ever produced. Resurrection began where New Blood had ended, with the logic that the cold had slowed Dexter's blood loss enough for the hospital team to save him. He woke from a 10-week coma in a facility in upstate New York, disoriented and in pain, with no Harrison and no Angela, and no version of the life he had been trying to build in Iron Lake. Harrison had been allowed to leave by Angela, who had managed the crime scene after the shooting to protect the boy, and had driven away from Iron Lake with no clear destination. Dexter's first act after recovering was to go to New York City, where Harrison had eventually landed, to find him and to attempt something that the show had been circling for years without fully committing to: a genuine reckoning between a father and a son about what had been done and what it had cost. The New York setting was the franchise's most ambitious relocation since the move from Miami to Iron Lake, and it worked in a different way. Where Iron Lake's smallness had been deliberate and constraining, New York's density and anonymity gave Dexter room to move without the fishbowl quality of everyone knowing everyone. He took work as a rideshare driver, blending into the urban fabric of a city, where a person with no fixed purpose could disappear into the traffic for days without raising questions. The city's particular character, its pace and its noise and its complete indifference to individual stories, suited Dexter in ways that Iron Lake never could. Peter Dinklage played Leon Prater, a billionaire whose wealth and social prominence had provided 30 years of insulation from any consequences for his interests. Leon was obsessed with serial killers in a way that had moved from academic fascination to active collection, his money giving him access to artifacts and information, and eventually to the killers themselves. He had constructed an invitation system, dispatching his enforcer Charlie across the country to find active killers, identify them through careful research, and approach them with a briefcase full of money and an invitation to an exclusive dinner. Uma Thurman played Charlie with a specific quality of lethal precision, a woman who had been doing dangerous work long enough that the danger had stopped registering as remarkable. Critics were divided on the performance. Some found it exactly what the show needed. Others found it too heightened for the register the rest of the season occupied. The dinner party itself was the season's set piece, the moment that established Resurrection's tone as something the franchise had not attempted before. A gathering of confirmed killers in a room together, each one aware of the others, each one navigating the specific social dynamics of a situation with no precedent. Dexter attended as Red, a pseudonym attached to a fabricated identity Charlie had apparently verified through her research. Around the table were 4 other killers played by performers the audience recognized from other contexts: Kristen Ritter, Neil Patrick Harris, Eric Stonestreet, and David Dastmalchian, each one bringing a different texture to what it looked like when someone who killed people sat at a dinner table and made conversation with others of the same category. The dark comedy that the original series had carried in its best seasons returned in full in that dining room, the show allowing itself to find the absurdity in its own premise without undercutting the genuine stakes underneath it. Harrison had killed someone. The hotel guest whose death Claudette Wallace, a New York homicide detective played by Katia Saraf, was investigating at the season's start, had been killed by Harrison rather than by Dexter, the franchise's first definitive confirmation that the damage had fully transferred to the next generation. Harrison was not comfortable with what he had done, was not building a code around it, was not processing it through any framework his father had given him. He was a young man who had killed someone and did not know what that made him or what it required of him going forward. And the arc of the season was built around Dexter's attempt to answer those questions, without simply giving his son a version of what Harry had given him. Angel Batista arrived in New York with questions that he had been carrying since Iron Lake. David Zayas returned to the role with the particular warmth that had always made Batista the most human presence in Miami Metro, but also with the specific weight of a man who had been carrying a suspicion for years and had enough evidence now to act on it. His pursuit of Dexter across the season was not framed as purely antagonistic. Batista was doing his job and honoring his dead colleagues, LaGuerta specifically, and the pursuit had a quality of obligation rather than hatred. The scenes between Hall and Zayas carried 30 years of fictional history behind them. 2 people who had worked together for most of their professional lives, now on opposite sides of a reckoning that had been delayed too long. The hallucinations that Dexter's recovering mind generated during the season's early episodes brought back Trinity, appearing in the hospital visions as a spectral presence through John Lithgow's brief return, an image of what the most consequential encounter of Dexter's life had finally come to mean at this distance. Deborah appeared through Jennifer Carpenter's voice and presence. Harry, through James Remar, occupied the same advisory role the character had always occupied, though the advice came from a different position now, with full knowledge of everything that had happened since New Blood. Jimmy Smits returned as Miguel Prado. Eric King's James Dokes appeared in a restored form, the character given back to the franchise in a way that his death in Season 2 had foreclosed for 17 years. The season's critical praise centered most consistently on Hall's performance, and specifically on the restoration of what critics described as the ingredient New Blood had lacked: the dark comedy running underneath the violence, the specific register of Dexter's internal voice, the quality of Hall inhabiting the character from the inside rather than from the outside. Reviewers who had praised New Blood's intentions while noting its tonal flatness found in Resurrection what they had been hoping to see: the show remembering what it was when it was best and applying that memory to a story that had genuinely new things to say. A second season of Resurrection had a writer's room beginning in the period following the finale, with Clyde Phillips and Hall both publicly committed to continuing. The Trinity Killer prequel, for which complete scripts had been written with Lithgow attached to provide narration and appear in flashbacks, remained in development without a confirmed green light, its status dependent on decisions being made at the new Paramount leadership level. The franchise that Jeff Lindsay had begun, with a quiet 2004 novel about a Florida serial killer, was, in August 2026, a multi-series universe with active production on at least one continuation and several others in various stages of discussion. What had made Dexter Morgan last 20 years in the cultural imagination was not the blood or the procedural mechanics or even the performances, as exceptional as those had been across the run. It was the premise, the specific moral permission structure that Lindsay had built into the first chapter of the first novel, and that the show had translated and then explored and then tested and then abused and then attempted to rediscover. A killer with a code, operating in the gap between justice and the law, asking the audience to hold two incompatible responses simultaneously. To root for him and to know better than to root for him, to want him to escape and to understand why he should not. The show had never fully resolved that tension. It had spent 20 years living inside it, and the audience had spent 20 years living inside it with the show. Harrison Morgan drove away from Iron Lake at the end of New Blood, a young man shaped by a father who had tried to run from what he was and failed. Dexter Morgan woke from a coma in Resurrection, a middle-aged man still alive against the evidence of multiple finales, looking for his son in a city of 8 million people. The distance between those two figures was the distance the story had been traveling across 2 decades, and whether it would ever fully close was the question the franchise was still working on as the writers' rooms opened and the cameras were being aimed at a second season. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.